let's go. All right. Welcome to, oh boy, this is a hard word to say, pediology, I think. This is discussion 3 or group 3. My name's Thomas, and you guys can go from there.
Yeah, my name is Alex Patov.
My name is Mahaya Underwood.
My name is Madison Bolus.
Oh.
I'm going
My
last.
name is AJ Davis or Adrian Davis.
Should be one other person besides me. I'm Ethan Gosma. I think that's it.
All right. Cool. Well done, team. All right. Let's hop into this. What were you guys' general impressions like reading chapter 1 and 2? Like, what kind of ideas were you guys thinking?
I liked chapter 1 more than I did chapter 2. I wrote a lot more. I liked the conversation of like the oppressor and like the oppressed and like the relationship between the two. One of my annotations I wrote, where did I say? How like dehumanization is the result of an injustice that causes violence in the oppressors, which then in turn engenders violence in the oppressed. I thought that was interesting because like, to be honest, reading this, I learned a lot because it was a lot of topics I just never really thought about. So I don't know, what else, what did you guys think?
That I can also connect something to that you'd mentioned. It was on page 44. I think chapter 1, once again, it's the concept of false generosity. So it was, as the oppressed try to find a way to, liberate themselves, humanize again, get that sense of humanization from the oppressors, going, like my understanding of what Fryer had mentioned was that you can, if you go and you counter something that the oppressors are good at, that's like a false generosity, or like a dichotomy, well, not dichotomy, it's false generosity in the case that you're sort of like aiming at the point of the oppressors, that's their strength itself. So if you're aiming at the strength, then it's kind of like it's the oppressor's strength, they'll come back at you with like an equivalent or a larger force. So as the oppressed, you have to find a way to be continuous and push back in different directions and make it not just an occupation, but also a preoccupation, something that you're preoccupied with all the time. So, yeah.
I thought it was one of the points that I remember reading was how sometimes oppressed people act as the oppressors. I thought that was pretty interesting, just how, it could shape your mindset a little bit. And like just to see how at the beginning of some oppressed to say they don't even see them based on the environment that they're in, or the way that like the way that they feel. That, but he didn't really go.
Right. So then that's the question, like, how do you, as the oppressed, when you get out of this state of, being oppressed and you get liberated, how do you like maintain that theory of, hey, I'm fighting for liberation of all people and not actually, how do you contain that and not become the oppressor themselves by, being lured into more subjectivism or more objectivism? I think like the author once again like mentioned that you have to have like an equivalent, or as you mentioned, dialogic relationship in between objectivism and subjectivism. I mean, in the other case, you fall into one sphere or the other, and that can lead, from my interpretation, to the oppressed becoming the oppressors, or people becoming the oppressors themselves. So it's like, how do you guys think you could effectively and efficiently maintain that outlook of being objective and subjective at the same time? Because I've heard people mention, like objectivity, being objective in the case of court cases, things of that sort. But clearly, in order to come to a decision, you have to be somewhat subjective. You have to like view the idea you have to view what's happening as actually going against one side and actually oppressing the other side, which includes subjectivism and objectivism. So, I mean, what are your additional thoughts on that?
Well, one kind of dynamic that I saw, I think it was 2019, and it was the Hong Kong riots. I don't know if you guys remember seeing that in the news, but I mean, from what I understand, because I've been to China twice, and I've kind of seen how they do things over there. And one thing that I see a lot is that your personal freedoms and like your freedom of speech, text, those kind of things that we take for granted over here is not valid over there, right? You still have the freedom of speech in China because it says it in their constitution that you have the right to that. But it also says in their constitution that they have the right to inflict punishment for any like sedition acts. So if your speech is not what they would think would be a normal speech or normal criticism of China, you can get punishments for that. And I think what we saw in Hong Kong was, I think the I guess a word for it could be like the oppressed kind of woke up. I think they started seeing the injustices that were happening in Hong Kong, and they started to speak out against it, and they started to speak out against China. And I think that's what the protest was about, is they were kind of like tired of China kind of interfering in their life, because they were led under the notion that it would be one China, two different governments, meaning Hong Kong would have its own judicial power. But as seen in the riots, that did not work out at all. And ultimately, China just, I think they passed like 5 new laws in Hong Kong, which just killed it all. And I think that's kind of China's, I guess you could say, MO. If they see something happen, they clamp down on it, and I think that's just unjust. And I think personally, I think China is probably the biggest oppressor in the world, is what I personally believe. So yeah, so I'm gonna take it from there.
So do you think, I mean, not just in the case that you're talking about, but like in other circumstances and so on, do you think that, how do you think that people come to the realization that they've been oppressed? You know what I mean? Like, how do you think that that comes around? Because, the book, it gives examples of like, the oppressed, they regain control, but then they're afraid that if they go against the oppressor will do something bad. But that itself is a fallacy, because, the fact is, if the oppressed go above, rise up and regain the liberty, then the oppressor goes down. You see what I'm saying? And it's kind of like, so how do people come to the realization, to finally like stand up and, or, go about with the movement?
Oh, I mean, I would probably say social media would probably be the number one driver. I mean,
I would
if you,
more
sorry, what were you saying?
I would argue that it's more apparent than that. In the relationship between the oppressor and the oppressed, it's almost blatantly thrown in the face of the oppressed that the oppressor is better, either through rhetoric and through, as he says in the book, propaganda, but just being more honest in that, it's the notion of perception of how they view themselves and how they think their community views them, similar to how when Mahaya brought up the point how the oppressor sort of behaves as how they think the oppressed behaves. It's the duality they talked about, where they're scared of being free, but they want freedom. So when they're finally out of their previous status quo, they see themselves now in the shoes of the oppressor, and that's the only way they know how to act that isn't oppressed. And they begin to act much, or really with the objectivity and the subjectivity with how you even confront the issue. I think it sort of highlights how complex and how deep it really goes, where when you have an issue like this, obviously these aren't new issues. I think it's ingenuous to even suggest that they're thousands of years in the making. It comes from anything from territory to resources to the notion of how the book describes it, people who want to own more things, whether it's people or whether it's just other objects that are natural that they think they're entitled to. It creates this whole hierarchy sort of structure, whether it's subliminal or if it's designed that way by those who are better off. Something sort of sets it in the motion. I think in the current age, I think the strongest indicator of it would be relative poverty. You know, you hear terms like systemic racism, which, I mean, you if you talk to anyone's grandparents or anyone's parents, the notion of no one woke up in 1990 and thought they were oppressed all of a sudden. I mean, children are sort of sheltered from it when they're younger. That's not some. It's a hard thing for parents to talk about. But even now, stories of people having to tell their kids how to behave when police are around because they're terrified of those interactions, and so on and so forth, how to behave in school, how to conduct yourself in public for preventing issues like this from occurring. It's like those are trained mechanisms, and those are learned behaviors and patterns from people over centuries of neglect. The embodiment of how are we not human, how is something less human, that's something that's been around forever, and it's honestly almost at this point a generational thought process, if not a lifestyle. So it's more or less how behavioral issue when it's hundreds of thousands of years old. I think that goes more in depth. If anything, I think social media in modern age sort of amplifies it, makes it a lot easier to notice things, makes it the reception of things happening are much faster. But I don't think it's gotten any better or worse. I think it's just been it's constantly been around. I mean, with social movements, the standard of living's gotten higher, but the overall structure, the view of oppressed and oppressor, I think if anything, we're living in a current act of liberation right now. So we're sort of seeing people actually take a stand for themselves, or trying to, but I don't think anyone knows how to really go about that. I mean, I personally didn't make much sense of the first chapter and how to actually go about fixing an issue like it. I mean, it seems great in theory, but how would you even begin to start a process of undergoing what the book suggests, in an actual organized social structure? You know what I mean?
Mhm.
If anyone go on that more.
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said. I guess I really found that interesting about to add on to the idea of like the oppressor and like the sub-oppressor, how they kind of said it in the book. One example that I thought about like, in our own society was internalized racism. So like who have experienced it maybe so much, or even if they don't really feel like they've experienced it, they kind of get this like internalized racism where they kind of push those ideas and like those bias onto others, even if they are a part of their group. Like for example, like things like colorism, and again, just kind of having these same ideas that the the oppressor or some of them may have of that group, and kind of having those ideas and pushing it onto their own people, a part of that group. It also mentioned like earlier, I don't know where it mentioned like basically how I think it said something where like sometimes if that person, that oppressed person, kind of where they want to be like the oppressor, and a way that I kind of thought about it is how, sometimes that oppressed person would feel as though sometimes they are maybe closer to that oppressor. Maybe it's in like the amount of money they have, or they feel like they have some type of hierarchy over like the people of their group, and so they tend to, again, I think that kind of goes back to like internalized racism and holding those views because they feel that maybe they're better than their peers. So that's something interesting.
I also saw it was also in chapter 1 how he talks about similar to back to on the concept of how would someone go about realizing that they're the oppressed. It talks about how a lot of people who are in an oppressed state, it sort of justified how they act out. And he was going on to explain that any sort of behavior you see, whether it's lashing out at another oppressed person or it's lashing out at a person or a group that is an oppressor, it's almost always reactionary, because how can you how can you enact violence, or how can you instigate someone who's instigated on you with violence or instigated on you with prejudice, or falls into suit with a social construct and a worldview that undermines your humanity. Sort of like I read about it in English. Martin Luther King coined the term the white moderate, the person who even if you're not expressing actual acts or thoughts of someone who is an oppressor, by benefiting and refusing to act, you're just as bad. And I think that goes to the false gratuity and the false charity that he coins in the first chapter as well, where he's talking about how Alex brought up earlier, just the notion of if you haven't actually like lived in it, and you're not willing to actually sacrifice it and to isolate yourself, are you really helping the cause at all? And he's pointing out that most people, even the most vocal social advocates, as noble and and just as they may seem, tend to defect when it actually reflects the idea onto themselves that they're going to have to give up some of their rights. Or individuals who are in oppressor status, or let's say privileged status, that's I think more fitting for the modern day. To them, it would only ever appear that they're giving up their privileges, even when in reality it's leveling out the playing field. Like it makes sense, like to think, well, I'm going to have less food on my plate for someone else to have more food, even if it's next to nothing at all. I'm on average, I'm going to have to give up some. But all we've ever seen, if we were born in this generation and we weren't necessarily part of some of the more gruesome acts that oppressors have forced onto people in history, to us, it looks like this is all we've ever seen and we're giving some of it up. So it creates like a contradiction in our thought process. So why would we be so willing to just give it up to help for the greater good? Because in our minds, we're having stuff taken from us, whether it's privileges or resources or so on and so forth. It's not right, but it also explains a little bit why, again, something in us implementing something like this in a social structure is a lot more gray area than you would expect, or it's a lot harder to pull off, or it's a lot, it's not by any means an easy issue to tackle. That's the other thing going on into chapter 2, why I think problem posing education is so important. If you spend your whole life going on and being taught banking education, another reason why that serves the oppressor so well is because it literally limits your cognitive ability. Like for example, they were talking about, you can teach someone that 3 times 2 is 6, but they don't understand the meaning of taking 3 and multiplying it by 2 of itself to get 6. They don't understand that. In similar fashion, you can tell someone observation that's made in science, but if you don't explain the phenomenon to them, or they don't actually have a meaningful understanding of it, something that becomes complex in their mind is just finite and a simple answer. In reality, it's a deep issue like this. And I think the reason why that's so powerful is because this is such a complex issue. Like the whole notion of the relationship between oppressor and oppressed, it's every little, it's almost like butterfly effect that takes generations to unfold and then even more generations to fix. And if you tell someone their whole life that either this is the problem or they're the problem, they won't ever develop the actual insight to realize what the real problem is, or, that's important to take away from it.
So it's like, kind of what I also got from what you had also mentioned right there was with the idea of problem posing education and, comparing that to the banking model and how people have, over time, after something, terrible, something horrible has happened in history where oppressor and oppressed were in, some kind of interaction there. Oppressors oppressing the oppressed, of course, there. And then after that passes 200 years later on, people who may have not lived through a similar thing and are, displayed as seeing their, I don't know, whether it's money, whether it's whatever being taken away from them, and say, you see what I'm saying? It's kind of what, yeah. But what I'm kind of getting to here is kind of like, the idea of problem posing education. If you continue that reality, if you continue that idea of, critically examining a question, critically examining an issue, and consistently doing that as well, then maybe it's possible. I definitely think so, to foster the idea of actually, viewing an issue in some kind of continuation, in conjunction, through time, not like seeing one part of time like, oh, this was separate from when I was alive, or this was separate from when this person was alive, or whatever of that sort. You know what I'm saying? But actually seeing that as connected to the person, and so finding that there's an actual purpose to still keeping the the message of the oppressed, the message of seeking liberty up, upholding that message, and not just letting that stay in the past,
Right.
as it was. So
Okay. I just Alex, on your point, I was just trying to understand. Could you simplify it slightly? Because I was a little confused on what exactly you were saying.
right, yeah. So basically, okay, yeah. So from the problem posed, when you have, for instance, we have two time frames, right?
Two
In
times.
one time frame, you have something that's really bad happening. Oppressors are oppressing the oppressed, right?
Okay.
Second time frame, you still have that basis, that idea, for instance, of like the oppressors oppressing the oppressed, but now it's in a different form. But because you have the banking model of education that's like continued from one instance to the other, to the other side, and you don't have like critical examination of the issue, it's not always easy to notice like the substance of the issue being carried out from one time period to the other.
So
Like the procedure of doing that may be different, but the substance of what's there is still the same. So if you have critical consciousness, if you have the problem posing model as your basis in viewing an issue and critically examining it, then you'll notice the similarity from one time period to the other. And then you can still hold up the idea of liberty and the idea of fighting for the oppressed and their humanization.
okay, so you're saying that like people, like, let's say there's a conflict. Okay, you're saying that people look at it and are taking away the wrong information from the conflict. Is that what you're trying to say?
Well, I'm trying to say it like in the sort of, but like with the lens of banking model education.
You're saying baking?
Banking,
Oh.
the banking model. Sorry, banking
Okay.
model. So,
No, you're good.
like,
You're
just
good.
to
I was
invest
like
in-
baking.
yeah,
Sorry.
the banking model of education. So that's the difference between the banking and the problem posing model of education. So yeah, I'm saying that you can get a different takeaway of the issue from you're not going to be like disregarding one point of time and saying that, oh, substance of that that issue isn't still you know what I'm saying. You're
Mhm.
still going to say that this issue, if you critically examine it, and critically examine it, you're going to be able to notice that the issue is still here after such a long period. And then two, while being able to critically examine the issue, you'll be able to critically act in a way that'll bring results for humanization.
So you're saying that oppression could be averted by like people thinking more logically, or like taking the time to like cool and think about the facts more? Is that kind of your argument?
I'm saying they should look at it with a critical consciousness, which revolves around the concept of problem posing model of education. So
Okay. So
Yep.
in your ideal form of government, would you have like, all right, so this is you at the top. All right, I'll call it Alex's country, right? This would be you. And then like executive, legislation, judicial, right? And then under that, you would have just like a lot of people reviewing like all the facts, like everything, to critically like analyze
Well,
like everything. So I'm just like, because I'm trying to like picture a government where there isn't oppression, and I'm just like I'm trying to wrap my head around it, and I just can't think that. Where like,
well,
is there
actually,
really a pure government? Can there really be a government where there is no oppression?
well, one of the things that I'd say is that I think the fallacy here is when a society or when a person or when a government believes that it's ontological, or it's in the state of being that or it's inherent that a society has oppression in it. The point is that a society moves towards a greater sense of liberty and a greater sense of humanization, not that you set a reference frame where you always view an issue with inherently having oppression in it. That's what I think. that. But as far as, the government structure that you mentioned, like, I mean, I feel like that connects to a different point, maybe not exactly towards the problem posing or model of education or the banking model of education, like topic that I'm talking about. Maybe, I mean, I think setting the government up in a specific way, bureaucracy, so on, this goes a little bit off the topic, I think,
Yeah.
of what I'm talking about, but, could help with fostering a specific model of education and a critical consciousness as well. But yeah, that's what I think.
Okay. Follow-up question. All right. Do you guys believe or subscribe to the belief that like there can be a utopia, like where everyone lives in this beautiful world and everyone gets along? Do you guys believe that a utopia could exist on Earth?
No,
No.
it could, but at the same time, it would take so much from every person individually. And most of America does not want to put in the work for any of that. So it couldn't happen. There's a possibility if everyone wanted it, but people are stubborn. That means people have to work, which means people actually have to do something. Therefore, in the end, really, it's not going to happen.
Essentially, there's a fallacy about utopias, more or less a deep philosophical question, and it always ends in something along the lines of the utopia would ultimately be for the greater good, even if it wasn't what people wanted, and therefore you're essentially taking what's for the greater good, using it to outweigh what the individual freedom. So you always end up giving up personal freedom for the perfect society, regardless of wherever it is, whatever the context is. Do I think it's possible? No. I think society, especially with social movements, and in the last 100 years alone, we strive to always aim towards a better version of ourselves. We see higher health standards, higher welfare standards, higher structures popping up all the time. I think there's nothing wrong with the notion that we as an embodiment of a population strive to do better. And as issues form and reform, we try to correct it, but that doesn't necessarily mean we always can or are always willing to. I think there are people like adamantly willing to disassociate before actually engaging an issue. I agree with that point. I don't think we purposefully put ourselves on a path of self-destruction. I think we purposefully inherent our own selfish needs and we push for those over pushing for the greater good far too often. I think that's how these sort of oppression relationships form in the first place. But thousands of years in the making, we're sort of seeing in the last 100 years alone, we've seen a massive social strive for increasing capacity for empathy in our community. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I do think it sort of highlights the issues of like bipartisanship, at least in our country, and how we have two distinct groups with a vast variety or spectrum of wants, and people fall on it like a dartboard. And it sort of makes it hard for us to like have solid objectives as a people or a population to actually aim for. But that's my personal notion on that.
Okay. Follow-up question. So this is a phrase that I like messes with me and it's when people say it's for the greater good. And I think that's a very powerful phrase because it's basically saying that you have to do this for everyone, right? And do you guys think that ties into kind of like the oppressive, dynamic a little bit? Like they're telling you it's for the greater good, but they're telling you to do it, right? It's not that you want to do it out of your own free will. It's that you're being oppressed into do it. Do you guys feel that?
If it serves an individual at the expense of another individual, it's not. It absolutely oppressive. If it serves everybody equally at the cost of everyone equally, I would say that would be the ideal description of a utopia. everyone has the exact same equity, opportunity, outcome, level of comfortability, whether it's as high or as low as anyone is used to. I mean, that's all relative. I mean, if you think of relative poverty alone, it's one of the largest causes for, on the malicious side of it, crime, and on the positive side of it, things like righteous riots that are basically protests unheard. Like it really sort of depends on where you stand in the, as that one TED Talk said, what house you rest in. But I still think it's possible. I don't think it's something that we are capable yet as a species. I don't think it's something that, I don't necessarily think, the book Lord of the Flies, it raises the point, are humans innately good or evil? I think we're both. It depends on the individual. It depends on how much you're willing to sacrifice for others. I don't think either is objectively better or worse for any individual. It's always at extreme that things fall through, but I don't necessarily think we're individually good or individually evil personally. And I think that's what it would boil down to in terms of, for the greater good, can we consider ourselves as one body and do something for the benefit of the species, which is generally unheard of biologically speaking, to sort of push for a goal like that. I don't think it's very much to this personally, not change topic or form, but I don't think it's impossible personally.
I think with that saying, like, specifically, everybody kind of has like their own definition of the greater good. Like the greater good to one person could be a complete different thing than the greater good to the other person.
Right.
Okay. Well, I like your guys' feedback on that. To kind of talk about that a little more. So like, let's bring in this. This is a hotbed question. Okay. A lot of people are talking about the vaccines, and as everyone know, the federal government came out and told the Department of Business or Bureau, whatever it's called, basically that if you have over 100 people, you have to get vaccinated, because in my visualization of it, I would say it's probably they're aiming for it's like the greater good. So do you guys believe that like the government should have the power to do that? Like, for example, like it's for the greater good that everyone gets vaccinated, or because there's rising levels of sugar addiction, it's for the greater good we have removed like soda or something, like that kind of dynamic. What are you guys' thoughts on that?
I'm going to add to that. So personally, just personally, don't nobody take offense. I feel like for the greater good is genuinely an excuse. It's just an excuse to get people to do something. Because at the end of the day, you can try to force a person to do it, and no matter what you say or do, they're either going to or they're not. But when you bring in for the greater good, that's putting so much on that person individually that they just feel obligated. They, at the end of the day, like they have to. For the vaccine, I don't think that the government should be able to do that, because there's more negative things than positive things that have to do with the vaccine right now. And if there wasn't such severe negative things that had to do with the vaccine, I feel like it could be promoted as a good thing. But overall, the government, the people that are supposed to be protecting us, are forcing something down our throats and telling us like we need this, but there's way too many negatives, like way too much. Like people are dying from this, and they're still like, here, you want to work with all these people, get shot up. Like you need to get a shot. And it's just not fair to individuals. I personally am vaccinated, but I am vaccinated for family because my sister has an autoimmune deficiency. So I didn't want to get vaccinated, but I did for my sister. Otherwise, I wasn't going to be able to see her. The side effects were not something that I personally have ever felt in my entire life. Not cool at all. And I mean, I could be infertile. I have no idea. That's a thing that, has Some people have proved it, some people haven't proved it. And at the end of the day, it comes down to the individual. So later on in life, if I try to have a kid and I can't, the vaccine could have, play a factor in that. But nothing is guaranteed for you getting the vaccine. There's multiple different variants that are just popping up everywhere. And the vaccine is no longer effective because it's a new variant. And those mRNAs, what are they? mRNAs
Yeah.
weren't made for that new variant. They were made for the original COVID-19 variant.
Mhm.
So I don't think it's something that they should be allowed to push onto you.
Okay. Does anyone else have any opinions on that?
I'd like to stay off that
All right.
bonfire.
We can-
Anyone
we
else? Oh,
can
okay.
We can move to the activities, the identify premises and stuff like that.
Yeah, what were some premises you guys found for chapter 1? And then we'll go to chapter 2. If anyone would share.
I guess one of them that could be used as evidence, but also as a premise. For instance, Paulo Freire, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly or his first name, but basically author states that the praxis of a people's quest is a recognition of necessity to fight for something. Praxis here being the, the necessity, I guess, the impetus, I guess, kind of how I interpreted it. It's tied into the raison d'être, which is in French means your reasoning or why you maintain for something to happen. So you maintain that it's necessary, the practice of people's quest is recognition of necessity to fight for something. The necessity of, I guess, of a people's quest is, comes from their recognition to fight for something or something of that sort. That's just something that I've, found.
Okay. The other one that I found that was earlier in the chapter that I liked was only the oppressed, not the oppressor, can liberate themselves and their oppressors to restore each group's humanity, sort of like how they talked about. One is an instigation and an act of violence to oppress someone who wasn't previously oppressed, and the other, even though it's a retaliation, if it's enacted properly, it can be an act of love, and it can restore the humanity to the oppressor who lost their humanity when they stole it from the other group. I thought that was pretty powerful. I think it goes hand in hand with the notion that not only are we not capable of liberating someone that we've oppressed, but they have to be willing to overcome the notion that they have to oppress us back to reach an equal status instead of just freeing both of us from this. I think it's a vastly more complex issue, but I think the notion that they have to sort of rise up and free both people is it's harder said than done, but it is a powerful message, and it gives some objectivity to the goal. I know you have to have subjectivity as well. I don't think it's a matter of this is a predetermined thing. We've had cycles throughout our history of people constantly being oppressed and then becoming oppressors, and I think it speaks volumes to say you have to break the cycle somewhere, essentially, for us to move on from this, or else it's not ever going to move on. People aren't going to feel liberated. I think people go as the extreme too far, but like speaking in modern day, how we see a lot of violence amongst communities that are worse off amongst themselves. It's the notion that they're lashing out at the oppressor indirectly. I think that is horrifying, not to them. Notion that it's still going on for this long, and it's a cycle that's still continuing, and it's an emotional expression of wanting liberation, but not how to do it. I think it's
Ethan.
Yeah.
I have a question for you, because
Okay.
what you're talking about in the book, there's a quote I want to read you. It says, freedom is acquired by conquest, not by gift. It must be pursued constantly and responsibly. do you agree with that? Like, do you believe that you have to like conquest freedom?
I don't think conquest in the book, the way it was used, means in terms of like conquistadors invading.
Oh, I understand that. Yeah.
I do think it's a constant upkeep. I
Mhm.
think we cycles of complacency and ignorance and prejudice, and we forget. You know, I think again, it's a generational thing. If your parents fought for a civil right 50 years ago and you never were raised, brought up in the time, and you don't know anything about it, especially with things like banking education, if you never hear about it, I think you wouldn't grow up with the same understandings. I think if
Mhm.
you're not taught to constantly pursue deeper meanings and deeper understandings for real issues and how the world works or complex relationships, I think it's very easy to fall into an ignorant stance again. I think
Yeah.
that's why of constantly repeating history of doing so. So
Mhm.
yeah, constant conquest, not just for freedom, but for maintaining social status that we've worked so hard.
Yeah.
I personally.
Okay. Well, we've had a pretty good discussion. So, does anyone have a good final question that we can round this good meeting off on?
I also kind of, sorry, because
No,
it
you're
was
good.
interesting when you guys mentioned, you made the analogy to like conquest or something. Whatever you said it from the
Yeah,
book
yeah.
there. I can't remember the exact words. But in the
Conquesting
preface,
freedom.
right? But in the preface, there's like in the preface on page 37, there's a quote that's it's radicalization nourished by a critical spirit is always creative. So as far as conquest or the idea of finding your way towards I guess well, not I guess, but like liberating yourself and so on, the radicalization of an idea, but being once again having the objective notions, subjective notions in there, it can lead to that final goal.
Yeah,
I agree.
well said. All right. Are there any other burning questions? Anything you guys want to get off your chest? Any rants, raves, whatever? Down for it all, or forever hold your truth, I guess. Does anyone else have anything to add? All right. I guess that'll be it for this meeting then, and I'll see you guys in the next meeting. I'll stop the recording then.